Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on the recent revisions to 34 CFR Parts 655, 656, and 657. We are excited to welcome such a dedicated and diverse group of professionals who share a passion for advancing international education, and particularly the focus on less commonly taught languages. This webinar is the first webinar in a series of webinars that our team will host during the next 12 months. Please try and attend all webinars and bring a colleague if possible. Today's presentation is an overview of the regulation revisions to the National Resource Centers and the Foreign Language Area Studies Fellowships programs. Future webinars will dive deeper into applicant processes and procedures. All webinars will be recorded and posted on our new IFLE website. As many of you know, the National Resource Centers and the Foreign Language Area Studies Fellowship programs are crucial to the U.S. Department of Education's mission to strengthen and promote international and foreign language education. The regulatory revisions were designed to improve the application and peer review processes, clarify terms and definitions, and strengthen program administration to support students, institutions, and educators in meeting the goals and objectives of the programs. As the global landscape shifts, the ability to communicate and engage across diverse linguistic and cultural boundaries becomes ever more critical. The importance of focusing on less commonly taught languages, or LICTLs, cannot be overstated. By expanding opportunities for students to learn and engage with these languages, we are not only enhancing their academic and professional futures, but also contributing to the broader cultural understanding and national security interests. This is an important moment to highlight how your programs are supporting and advocating for less commonly taught languages on your campuses. Whether through curriculum development, outreach initiatives, or student support, we encourage you to be bold and creative in advancing this goal. It is vital that we continue to build awareness and institutional support for these languages, many of which are underrepresented in higher education, yet critical for building a globally informed and prepared workforce. Thank you again for your time, commitment, and your ongoing efforts to support international education and language learning. Now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Tim Duvall and Brian Swick, who will present the key regulatory revisions.
Thank you, Sarah. So as Sarah just told you, this webinar is being recorded, so you can refer to it later. We're going to present quite a bit of information, and what we're going to do today is give you an overview of what has changed. As many of you know, and maybe even hopefully all of you know, we recently published new regulations changing parts 655 of 34 of the Code of Federal Regulations, 656, and 657. 656 regulates the NRC program, the National Resource Centers program. 657 regulates the FLAS program, the Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowships program. And 655 is a sort of general regulatory framework for those programs. So today, what Brian and I are going to do is walk you through the sort of an overview of what has changed, just so you get a sort of big picture view of what to expect. And in subsequent webinars, we will dig in more detail to some of the bigger changes or the more sort of complex changes that might require a little bit more assistance. So, as probably all of you, but maybe not all of you know, the National Resource Centers program and the Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowships program were first authorized in Title VI of the National Defense Education Act in 1958. That act instructed the Office of Education, we didn't yet have a Department of Education, to provide contracts for institutions of higher education to support centers for the teaching of any modern foreign language, especially those that were not readily available in the United States. And the NRC program and the FLAS fellowships program continue to provide grants to institutions of higher education and fellowships to individuals under Title VI of the Higher Education Act of 1965 as amended. We just wanted to sort of put that out there to kind of frame this discussion. This is what we're talking about, and we will talk about some of the changes that we have made in this webinar. So here you'll see a sort of overview of the technical assistance webinars that we're going to provide about the revisions to the NRC and FLAS program regulations. So today, October 24th, you see that we're giving an overview. On November 14th, we will talk about the geographic world area requirement and the allowable costs for NRC and FLAS. Those are, in particular, what we're going to be talking about are how that has changed in the new regulations. On December 12th, we will talk in detail about the selection criteria for NRC and FLAS. And then on January 23rd, we will talk about FLAS eligibility and administrative planning considerations. After that, we will have other webinars that are more specific to the competition that will be coming up in about a year. We'll talk a little bit about that today as well. So we just kind of want to frame this for you in this way so that you know what to expect today. Actually, I think I'm going to turn my camera off to decrease distraction. Just so that you get a sense of what to expect today. We're not going to dig real deeply here into things like the geographic world area requirement, allowable costs, selection criteria, and so on. Those we'll save for a later date so that you can ask those kinds of more specific questions at those times should they arise. Also, you can download a file if you look on there. We will make this PowerPoint available. It's going to be on the NRC and FLAS pages of the IFLE website. You'll be able to go in there and you can click on some of these links. For example, you can click on a link to get a PDF of the upcoming webinars for ATRD in general, including these webinars. We also have a YouTube channel, as Sarah already mentioned, where you will be able to view this webinar and any other IFLE content. So please feel free to do that. There's a lot of information that we're going to share, and I just want to make sure that you know where you can get this information if you want to take a closer look, and we recommend that indeed you do take a closer look. Also, if you have any questions, if you look at the top, actually it's at the top of my screen, I don't know where it is on your screen, but you'll see a Q&A button. You can click on that if you have any questions, or you can use the chat function. Either way, the Q&A is sort of a new function, I think. So we're not quite sure exactly how it's going to work, but feel free to submit your questions there or in the chat. And we'll answer whatever we can. Also, there is a form for submitting questions that you can use during today's webinar or after today's webinar. There's a link there, as you can see, to that form, and you can submit questions there. We will not be answering all questions today during today's webinar. It's quite possible that there will be questions that will require more thought by us or discussion among the team. And we want to make sure that we're able to give clear and concise answers. So it might take some time for us to respond to some of your questions. Also, any questions that arise today that we're not able to answer will be incorporated through the webinar series and in future guidance, future written guidance in particular. Also, just keep in mind that any specific details about the next competition, in particular, things like competition priorities, precise dates of the next competition, and so on, are not yet known. We don't know these yet. And we're not likely to know them for quite some time. But when we have that information, we will, of course, share it. Our goal is always to be as transparent as possible. And one way of being transparent is by informing you now that we do not know what the competition priorities are yet, and we do not know precise dates for the next competition. We can give you a rough idea, and we will a bit later. So this is what we're going to do today. We are going to talk about the major regulatory changes. We're going to help you sort of navigate what has changed on a sort of grander scale, a big scale. What's the big picture of what has changed? We're going to discuss the major changes to 34 CFR 655. These are the general provisions that I mentioned earlier that pertain to both NRC and FLAS and some of our other programs, in fact. So we'll talk about those. Those are already in effect, by the way. They went into effect on September 26th, 2024. Then we're going to talk about the major changes to 34 CFR 656, which is NRC, and 657, which is FLAS. Those will go into effect next year, and they will apply to the next competition. So those of you who have grants now, these new regulations will not apply to the current grants. They will, however, go into effect for the next grant cycle, including the competition. And then we'll talk a little bit about plans for the next competition.
So in this next section, I'm going to take over and provide you with some of the tools and general information that you may need to navigate a time of major regulatory changes for these programs. So, as we've been mentioning, a lot of change has been happening for the NRC and FLAS programs. And obviously, if you need to get a handle on those changes, you're in the right place at a webinar like this. But we also want to make sure that you know where to find all of the documents involving these changes and how to process, read them, and access them at any time when you need to look at them or share them with colleagues. And of all of the documents, the one that's the most important is the one that's referred to as the Notice of Final Rule, which was published in the Federal Register. And in this document, you can find the full revised text of the regulations for the NRC and FLAS programs. In addition, part of what makes this document challenging to read and navigate at times is that it includes a lot of other information as well. However, a lot of this information is really important when trying to understand the reasoning and the meaning of the changes that are incorporated into the text of the regulations themselves. And for example, in the Notice of Final Rule, you'll find an extensive discussion of the public comments that we received during the regulation writing process and our responses to the public regarding those comments, which can be very helpful in understanding IFLE's reasoning for the changes that were eventually adopted. This document is really the single most important document you can look at to find what actually changed, particularly before all of the new rules and regulations go into effect next year. Which leads to the next item that you see listed here. So we've been talking about regulations, which means that one of the other important sources of information is the Code of Federal Regulations itself, which is made available to the public both in its PDF published form, but also in the much more user-friendly eCFR or electronic CFR website. And this has the advantage that it's updated dynamically and can be accessed at any time. Unfortunately, this portal only updates as rules and regulations go into effect. So as Tim already mentioned, you can now find the new changes to Part 655 online in the eCFR. However, you will not find the regulatory changes addressed in the NFR for Part 656 or Part 657 yet. So that's why that NFR, that Notice of Final Rule document, is very, very important until about a year from now. And then it's also important to keep in mind that IFLE has incorporated various proposals and reasoning in the initial Notice of Proposed Rulemaking that came out earlier this year. Although this is not as useful or as definitive as the Notice of the Final Rule, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM, remains somewhat helpful because we don't generally repeat explanations that we provided in the NPRM if they still apply to the final rule and were not germane to the public comments or questions that we received. And so those two documents, the notice of final rule as well as the notice of proposed rulemaking, can really help clarify the reasoning and thought process that we went through within IFLE when making these changes. And do note that if you do find contradictions between the NPRM and the NFR wins, right? That was the final statement from our office regarding these changes. And so don't be confused. The NFR takes precedence over the NPRM. And we will generally develop a lot of the assistance that we're providing in these webinars and in the future from the reasoning and discussions that we provided in these documents. And then, when we're thinking about these various kinds of documents that are out there, and we're thinking about the legacy of these programs that, as Tim mentioned, go back decades, we also want to provide you with some tools to help navigate what is more and less binding and what is more and less authoritative when it comes to understanding how the programs operate. And so, as a discretionary grant program funded by the US government, we are first and foremost, of course, bound by the Constitution, but more practically, our programs are authorized by a piece of legislation that was adopted by Congress and that has, been codified into the US Code that draws from Title VI of the Higher Education Act of 1965. So if there's something that appears in the text of the statute, we must follow that. The regulations build upon that foundation and clarify a lot of what's in the statute and provide a lot of the operational guidance for the programs. However, even though we tried to write regulations that were relatively comprehensive, they may not address every single case or every single situation or item or question that may come up when administering these types of grant programs. And so we also draw upon the general regulations created by the Department of Education, known as EDGAR, as well as the even broader set of uniform guidance provided in 2 CFR 200. And so these represent the larger regulatory framework in which discretionary grant programs operate. And then periodically, IFLE or the department may publish additional notices in the Federal Register, such as notices inviting application, notices of priority. Recently, we published that notice of the fellowship amounts. And when these are published, they also help supplement that very formal type of guidance that help in the administration of the programs. And then below that, we have situations like today where we're providing a webinar or where we release manuals or post things to our website that also provide a less formal type of guidance to all of you in how to apply or administer the programs. And below that is the type of guidance that people like me or Tim provide when we're emailing with you or talking with you. And this represents a type of informal guidance about how the programs operate. And generally, in terms of the order of precedence, items listed higher up on this list are more authoritative and more important, right? So even if Tim and I want to be really friendly and helpful, we really can't contradict anything at a higher level. And it's really difficult to contradict the statute. And so we're really bound by what we find at these higher levels of authority. But please note that the new regulations do make substantial changes to these programs. And so it is not necessarily great to rely on guidance issued before September 2024. And so with that in mind, please note that when you're looking at the NPRM or the proposed text of regulations, those are not a reliable source of the changes. If you're looking at explanations from the NPRM that were contradicted by the NFR, that's also not very helpful. Public comments, although they were helpful in getting us to think through some of the changes, are not in and of themselves an authoritative source of guidance for implementing the programs. In addition, previous versions of the regulations, such as those you can find on the ECFR today for NRC and FLAS, will not necessarily be helpful next year when the new regulations take effect. And also, previous versions of program guidance in webinars, published manuals, etc., will not necessarily be helpful in administering the programs when the new rules come into effect. Now, just in terms of nailing down the issue of timing and scope, although Tim pretty much mentioned this, note that the changes, particularly to the general provisions, affect a larger number of programs than just the National Resource Centers and FLAS Fellowships program, but the biggest changes were made to these two programs. And those changes to the general provisions have already gone into effect, as I mentioned, and as Tim mentioned, the bulk of the remaining changes will go into effect with the new round of applications and grants made next year. Now, we've been talking a lot about change. There is some good news here, though, that not everything has changed. And so, despite all of the changes that we've been talking about and will continue to talk about for months, we really want to hammer home that there are certain things that remain more or less the same to the extent that we can control them. For example, IFLE's general approach to funding and imagining the size of our programs remains the same. In terms of the length of the FLAS and NRC programs, we still anticipate making 4-year grants. And in addition, we still will, to the best of our ability, continue to run competitions every 4 years. We anticipate that the next competition will be in the next fiscal year, approximately a year from now. We anticipate running the NRC and FLAS competitions on the same timeline, and we also anticipate using the same reviewers for both sets of applications, for NRC and FLAS. And just as in the previous competition cycle, we anticipate that you should be able, if you're interested in applying under both programs, to develop a single narrative that could be submitted to both programs that can be assessed by those same set of reviewers. And also, just a general note that if you're a current grantee, the basic structure of FLAS fellowship payments will continue to be the same in the future. So those are what's not changing.
And here is what is changing. Here are some of the major changes to 34 CFR 655. So as we've been saying, the 6655 provides general provisions for international education programs in the department. Here are some of the things that we did in 655. Our aim was to try to make certain aspects of these programs easier for both us to administer and for the field to administer. So that would be many of you who are on this call. One of the things that we did is we added a new definition of diverse perspectives. And actually, what we did was we added a definition of diverse perspectives. We've been administering these programs for a very long time without a clear definition of what we mean by diverse perspectives. So in 34 CFR 655.4, you can find the new definition. I'll go through it in some detail in a future slide. We also added some other definitions. We had a definition of areas of national need. We talked about the consultation on the areas of national need. Those of you who have applied for our programs are familiar with these terms, but we've done our best to clarify what we mean by those. We added a definition for intensive language instruction, and we took from the statute a definition of area studies, just to make sure that we're clear about what we're working with here. We revised references to general education and grant terms, for example, distance education. As many of you know, in the last 4 years or so, this has become especially important. Distance education has become a sort of go-to, and in particular, we've seen it used for language courses, and so we wanted to make sure that we were clear about that. We also added purposes of the international education programs. These were adapted from the statute, but it's a new section in 655. If you look at an earlier version of 655, there will be no 655.5. We added this in order to encourage our grantees to think about their projects within the context of the overall or overarching program that they are a part of. The NRC program seeks to do particular things, and all of our grantees are part of accomplishing those. And I'll talk in some detail about those in a subsequent slide. And also 655 has general selection criteria. This doesn't really affect NRCs or FLAS grantees too much, but we revised the one criterion at 655.31E2I to include libraries as a type of facility. So here's our definition of diverse perspectives. I'm going to read it, even though I know you can read it, just so that we can sort of all be on the same page here. It means a variety of viewpoints relevant to understanding global or international issues in context, especially those derived from scholarly research or sustained professional activities and community engagement abroad, and relevant to building multifaceted knowledge and expertise in area studies, international studies, and the international aspects of professional studies, including issues related to world regions, foreign languages, and international affairs among stakeholders. This is a lengthy definition, as you can see, but our goal here was to try to be sort of as clear as we can be with regard to what we mean by this, while also making this definition a sort of academic or scholarly sort of definition, a definition that excludes politics. We're not, when we talk about diverse perspectives, we're not talking about political or ideological perspectives. That's not what we're talking about. And this definition should clearly indicate that. Some of the other definitions: areas of national need, right? These are the various needs in government, education, business, nonprofit sectors, and so on, for expertise. So the needs in government for expertise in foreign language, area, and international studies. These needs are identified by the Secretary to be as significant for maintaining or improving the security, stability, and economic vitality of the United States. The Secretary does that by reaching out to other agencies to find out, what are the needs in commerce, what are the needs in defense, what are the needs in diplomacy, so on. So the Secretary consults on areas of national need, and through that consultation determines what those areas are. This is something that happens before every competition, and so that we are as informed as we can be and as up to date as we can be when it comes to determining what the country needs and what we should ask our applicants to address. So I mentioned earlier a new section, 655.5, what are the purposes of the international education programs? I'm not going to go through all of this. You can read it on your own when you have the time. And again, as you know, these slides are being made available via our website. But what we're doing here is talking about our programs in IFLE, the international programs in the Department of Education, and what their purposes are. So we want to develop a pool of international experts to meet national needs. Now, the Department of Education can't really do that. We ask you, our grantees, to do that. That's the purpose of putting out the grant competition. That's why we run the grant competition, to get your help to accomplish these goals. And so what we're asking in these new regulations is for our applicants to consider how their project will contribute to the overall purposes of international education programs. So this isn't going to apply to every. It's not going to apply. Not every one of these will apply to NRC, for example, or not every one of them will apply to FLAS. Some of them might only apply to LRC, the Language Resource Centers program. Some of them might only apply to the Undergraduate International Studies and Foreign Language program, and so on. But taken together, these are the purposes of our programs. And when we look at the whole universe of our programs, we expect them to together provide these kinds of expertise or products or expertise in languages or whatever. And then this is still part of 655.5. It brings in the consultation on areas of national need. It talks about the periodic survey of fellows who have participated in the FLAS fellowships program. The amendment to the Higher Education Act in 2008 mandated a FLAS tracking study. So this is just making mention of that. And all of this, again, is all part of the purposes of the international programs.
So in this next segment, we'll touch upon the major changes for the NRC and FLAS program. And please keep in mind that each of the major changes highlighted here will either be the subject of its own webinar or will be a major portion of one of our upcoming webinars related to the regulatory changes. So as Tim was saying, one idea to bring away from today's presentation is that these regulatory changes are intended to increase that alignment between all of the activities that are carried out using grant funding and those overarching program purposes. And particularly for the NRC program, there's an acknowledgement that the potential contribution is quite broad. And as Tim mentioned, the alignment for each program will depend on the contours of that program. So for example, the FLAS Fellowships program may be more aligned with producing a pool of experts on international topics. So I think that's a big animating idea with some of these changes, which is to articulate what's being accomplished using some of that vocabulary from those larger program purposes, which helps you identify what Congress thinks is important and helps us articulate how our grantees are meeting those program purposes and needs and goals. Now, in terms of the specific big changes that we're thinking about here today, as Tim mentioned earlier, one of those would be the introduction of the geographical area of focus requirement for NRC and FLAS. Also, we've done a lot of work to refashion the selection criteria. In addition, we also wanted to further distinguish the Comprehensive National Resource Center category from the Undergraduate National Resource Center category. And so a lot of the changes tease those two types of National Resource Centers apart and perhaps open up some space for new applicants to join the program or at least try. And in addition to that, the regulatory changes add consideration of a student's educational program as an eligibility requirement for FLAS fellowships. So going a little more into depth on the topic of the geographical area of focus requirement, we believe that this change emphasizes languages in world regions and world areas are aligned with the consideration of broader global and international topics, and that in fact, by supporting a world area focus, we're also promoting a synthesis between area studies and area or global studies as well. This change will eliminate a standalone international program category for the next round of competitions for the NRC and FLAS programs. And in terms of what this actually looks like in the regulations, we include one example here for the NRC program, although the FLAS program has a similar provision as well. And so as you can see how it's worded here, it says that a center's area of focus for research, teaching, training, instruction, and project activities must be aligned with both of the following requirements. 1, the area of focus must be a geographical world area or a geographically designated region that spans multiple world areas. And 2, research, teaching, training, and instruction in specific languages, countries, regions, societies, or other units of analysis related to the area of focus described in this paragraph 1 above must be conducted at the institution. And again, we see this geographic world area requirement as a productive requirement that will help align the program with the program purposes and ensure that there's adequate investment and opportunities and innovation occurring in these area-focused opportunities or area-focused educational resources and programs. And with that in mind, we do hope that this will be beneficial to the educational community at the national level. The next major change, as I already mentioned, is the change to the selection criteria for NRC and FLAS. And generally, we believe that these changes will enhance the clarity of the selection criteria, reduce that redundancy, and again, increase the alignment of project activities and project outcomes and project purposes to make sure that they're all working together towards similar ends. And also, we've managed to reduce some of the specific selection criteria and enhance the degree to which they're similar across the programs. And so generally speaking, at the highest level, we were able to consolidate all of the selection criteria into the categories you see here. And as before, the categories for the NRC and FLAS programs remain quite similar. And in fact, these revisions actually led to the introduction of two new categories for the FLAS program, addressing project design and rationale and project planning and budget. These topics covered in the sub-criteria for these categories are entirely new for the most part for the FLAS program, but in fact will bring the types of requirements for the narrative more in line with what was also expected for the NRC category. So they're quite similar. They're not exactly the same as in the past, but hopefully this format will make sense and will help us select excellent applications for the next round of grants. And then, as we mentioned earlier, one of the other changes that's occurring as a result of the new regulations is the attempt to tease apart the comprehensive national resource centers from the undergraduate national resource centers. These two categories had been a little muddled in the past, and we hope that the new regulations will help distinguish them a little more clearly by highlighting the distinct roles and characteristics envisioned in the statute adopted by Congress. And then we also wanted to make sure that those selection criteria pay attention to these differences as well. And as you can see in the table at the bottom of this slide, there are at least three different characteristics we could think of in terms of where these differences surface, but I do encourage you all to read at length the detailed discussion and description of these two types of centers in the new regulations. But just to highlight here quickly, when we're talking about a comprehensive national resource center, we're thinking of a center at an institution of higher education that has a large population of graduate and professional students in addition to undergraduates, and that within the world area of focus of that center, there is a significant contribution to research being made. A critical mass of scholars is present. There are important library collections, and that fundamentally the university or the center has the ability to provide highly specialized training relating to that world area. And then in terms of allowable activities and cost limitations, we wouldn't imagine any specific ones for this center type. By contrast, an undergraduate NRC is predominantly focused on providing education for undergraduates. Even though some graduate students may exist at the institution or within the center, the real focus here is on undergraduate teaching and learning and the preparation of undergraduates to matriculate into advanced training opportunities, particularly at other institutions. For example, at some of those comprehensive centers that I just mentioned. And accordingly, the new cost and activity limitations will require centers of this type to predominantly benefit undergraduate instruction and training. And so that would be a new requirement that follows through from the definition through the selection criteria into the types of activities that will be allowable. But again, we'll go into greater detail on these types of topics in a future webinar. And then finally, as we mentioned, the changes to the FLAS program will add a new eligibility requirement for FLAS fellows, particularly for academic year FLAS fellows. And this will ensure that the FLAS fellowships program is aligning with institutional support and student commitment to area studies, global studies, and international studies in the institution's curriculum. And as I mentioned, this will be especially important for academic year fellowships. However, even with this new requirement, we've built in flexibility for STEM and professional students who may struggle to identify suitable curriculum options. And we've also built in additional flexibility on top of that for fellows who will be pursuing summer language study.
So, as promised, we'll talk a little bit about planning for the next competition. Let's begin by talking about what is a center for these programs. We don't require any specific organizational structure for grantees under these programs. A National Resource Center is a designation for grantees that can take any number of organizational forms. It can be an actual center, it could be a group of centers, an institute, it could be a subdivision of a dean's office or a provost's office, it could be a department. The key consideration is that there is the administrative capacity in place to implement the grant and to coordinate the various educational resources that are available on the campus to sort of corral them for the purposes of the grant, to make sure that the right kind of training is provided for, say, a comprehensive center versus an undergraduate center, and so on. That's partly what the application narrative is for, is to explain what your organizational structure is and how you're going to marshal your resources to implement the grant. So regardless of the form, the units need to have clear oversight and they need to have governance arrangements in place. And again, that's partly what the application narrative is for you to explain the governance and oversight arrangements. A FLAS fellowships program is any grantee that is not also a National Resource Center. So you can see we've talked about this in the new regulations 656.6, what definitions apply to this program, the National Resource Center, 657.7, what definitions apply, what is an approved center, it's an administrative unit of an institution of higher education that has both received an allocation of fellowships under this part and a grant to operate a center under 34 CFR Part 656. Approved program means a concentration of educational resources and activities in modern foreign language training and area studies with the administrative capacity to administer an allocation of fellowships under this part. So you can have an approved center that is both an NRC and has an allocation of FLAS fellowships. And you can have an approved program that just has an allocation of FLAS fellowships and is not an NRC. In terms of the anticipated competition timeline, we expect applications to become available early in the next fiscal year, 2026. The federal government is currently, has actually just begun approximately 3 weeks ago, fiscal year 2025. So approximately a year from now, in late 2025, is when we expect the application to become available. So the notice inviting applications, we hope and expect it to come out in approximately a year from now. And then we expect to notify applicants of the competition results by the middle of 2026. So May, June, something like that is what we're shooting for. All of this depends on funding, depends on action from Congress. It depends on timely action from Congress. So assuming all of that, assuming that there's timely action from Congress, we plan to be ready to announce the competitions approximately a year from now. Obviously, keep an eye on our various communication outlets, which are deep and well maintained by our communications team. And also keep an eye on the Federal Register for competition announcements. So for those of you who plan to apply or are thinking about applying, and this applies to those who currently have grants or those who have never had one of our grants, here is some advice for you. First, as Brian indicated earlier in this webinar, carefully review the entire notice of final rule, especially the full text of the new selection criteria and the list of documents required for applications. That list of documents has changed a little bit for those of you who have already applied to our programs before. It's a little bit different. So make sure that you're very clear on what documents are required, as well as how to address the new selection criteria. And don't worry, we are going to talk in more detail about the selection criteria, not only as Brian indicated in a future webinar discussing the regulatory changes, but we will also give specific technical assistance once the NIA is out, or soon before it's out. So don't worry, we will provide as much information as we possibly can. What we want is you to be able to do the work for us that we need done to accomplish the goals of these programs, which are, of course, related to what the United States needs when it comes to foreign language and area studies expertise. We also suggest that you begin data collection and project planning as soon as possible. And again, even if you've had our grants before, but especially if you have not, it is a best practice to begin as soon as possible. There's a lot of coordination that has to happen on campus to marshal the resources that are available to deliver the programming that we're asking for. There's quite a bit of data that needs to be collected. And as all of you probably know, that's not always the easiest thing on these big campuses with complicated processes for these sorts of things. Also, you should identify new or revised internal policies and procedures necessary to support grant and program administration if selected as a grantee. In other words, you should start thinking through how you're going to address the administration of a center, perhaps, or the administration of an allocation of FLAS fellowships. You should make sure that you have procedures in place, governance arrangements, understanding with deans and provosts and colleagues and other departments and so on. This is a complex program, but these are complex programs, but they are they have many benefits on campus, not to mention the benefits that they provide to us, the United States. And please do not hesitate to contact your program officers to ask questions. That's what we're here for. You're not bothering us. We are more than happy to help whenever we can. There are some questions we won't be able to answer right now. For example, exact timing, competition priorities, exactly what the competition is going to look like, and so on. We don't know that yet, but we can, we all have plenty of experience running these competitions and administering these grants, and we can help you think through certain things as they come up. So if you have any questions, please ask. Other things, and some of this is repetitive, but the priorities for the competition vary. We don't yet know exactly what they're going to be, but they will be established in the NIA, the notice inviting applications for each of the programs. When you read the program regulations, you'll see that there's a list of many possible priorities. Those are all priorities that are possible and sort of already approved. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be in the competition, but they could be. But the department can also set other priorities. So if we end up with we will have a different administration starting in January, and that administration might have specific priorities that they want to include, and they have the discretion to do that. And we won't know that until they tell us one way or the other if they have some priorities that they want to set. We also will provide, and again, we've already intimated this, but we will provide plenty of pre-application technical assistance to address the details of the application process for potential applicants. And we will be very precise in the expectations for the components of the application. After the new grants have been awarded, we will also provide technical assistance to address the details of program administration for grantees, including the reporting requirements, and any documentation requirements. And finally, we didn't mention this yet, but the statute provides for special purpose grants for NRCs. It's possible for us to run a separate competition for established NRCs for a special purpose. So it could be, a library project. It could be a language institute or whatever. If we end up being able to do something like that, we will release information and we will do all the technical assistance and so on for those. Right now, there's nothing at all available for special purpose grants, but we did clearly spell out what a special purpose grant looks like and who is eligible for it in the new regulations, which again, don't go into effect until next year. But if you have any questions about that, we're not going to be able to answer them until we know whether or not we will ever be able to run any special purpose grant competitions. Here is just a taste of some of the upcoming IFLE programming. These are not webinars that are specifically associated with these regulations. We've already talked about that at the beginning of this webinar, but the FLAS survey is out. That the report has been written and published, and our colleague Donna Sapatoru, who ran that survey, is going to do a webinar for it on November 6th. There's a link there or a meeting ID with passcode for you to be able to join that. I highly recommend that you join it, especially FLAS grantees or prospective FLAS grantees. But all of you are welcome to attend that webinar. And also don't forget about International Education Week. There we have our contact are Danielle Richardson and Amy Marion, two of our colleagues. Please reach out to them with any questions about this. And there is a URL there for you so that you can see what we're planning for International Education Week. Finally, if you have any specific questions about the regulations, here are links to the final notice of final rule and the notice of proposed rulemaking. Remember the hierarchy of authority that Brian talked about earlier in the webinar, but you can find explanations and the full text of the new regulations in the notice of the final rule. And it will, there you can get an understanding of what we were thinking when we made changes and how your comments affected what it is that we ultimately decided to do with regard to this. And again, the notice of proposed rulemaking will provide some background as well, because we didn't change everything from what we proposed. So our explanations there could be quite helpful as well. And of course, you can always reach out to us. There's Brian's email address. There's mine. Feel free to reach out if you have specific questions about the regulations. Here's contact information for all of us who work on Title VI. You can see this is broken down by world area, so that you can reach out to the relevant person. If you're working in the Western Hemisphere, for example, Carolyn Collins is your point of contact. If you're working in Africa International, Danielle Richardson is your point of contact, and so on. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions or concerns as we move forward. And finally, please connect with us. We have a Twitter, or I guess it's called X page. We have a YouTube channel. We have a newsletter. The newsletter comes out quarterly and sometimes in between, depending on what kind of news needs to be announced. But it's an excellent resource for everything that's happening in IFLE. And finally, there's a link to our website. So thank you all for attending. And let me see what we're doing when it comes to questions.
Thank you so much, Tim and Brian. This is Sarah again, and I do want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for the first of many webinars. And I do want to take a moment to recognize both Tim and Brian for their dedication and their tireless work to publish the regulatory revisions in the final rule. This was a 2-year project that began as soon as we made the fiscal year 2022 NRC and FLAS awards. And after completing that cohort in fiscal year 2022, it was evident we needed to revise the selection criteria to be less redundant and enhance the clarity of application instructions and align the administration of the programs with the developments in modern foreign language and area studies. This project required laser focus, discipline, and intelligence to meet internal deadlines for publishing the regulations. I also want to thank all of you and all the commenters who took the time to comment on the notice of proposed rulemaking. As stated earlier, the public comment period allows stakeholders to influence regulatory policies, ensuring they address the needs of institutions and students alike. Your input was crucial in finalizing the final rule. Moreover, your consistent commitment to providing thoughtful feedback helps us continually improve the Title VI programs. As stated previously, our team has developed a year-long timeline of technical assistance activities to ensure that all revisions are thoroughly discussed and transparent to the higher education community. And we do hope to publish a notice inviting applications, hopefully in a year from now, after a full year of technical assistance, and believe that these revisions will provide an opportunity for institutions of higher education to ensure that every student can thrive in an interconnected world. So we're at an hour, but I believe we do have some time for questions. No questions. You did such a good job. There are no questions. Okay, there is a question in the chat. It says, okay, regarding the potential deadlines for upcoming competition, each university has something like a sponsored projects where we have to submit our grants and get approval to submit them to grants.gov and ultimately to Department of Ed. Will the closures of those offices be taken into consideration when coming up with the competition schedule?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Closures for holidays, maybe? Maybe it's closures for holidays.
I assume that's what it means.
Yeah, we do our best to we actually we even try to time our webinars based on on academic schedules. Many of us have worked in academia, and we know that there are exigencies when it comes to these sorts of things, and we will do our best to take into account the academic calendar when we're devising the notice for application and the timing for it and for the submission of applications.
And then we always need to balance that against getting it out and making sure that we have enough time to turn around and get the results out. So there's always tension there.
Exactly. It's impossible to get it all right, but we do our best to work with you and to at the same time do what we can to make sure that we can get these grants out. Jennifer also asked, can you summarize eligibility changes and flexibility for summer? So that's for FLAS. The eligibility is related to the educational program requirement, and flexibility for summer is that you don't need to take into consideration educational program in the summer, because the summer is just intensive language. And so the flexibility that we built in was that the educational program eligibility part of that doesn't apply in the summertime. The specific questions like 30, 45, 90-day turnaround, we don't know yet. We're not going to be able to answer stuff like that at this point. Our goal is always to have to give you as much time as possible. but it's going to depend on a whole number of things. When, what kind of timing we have before we can determine that. So we can't really tell you, other than to say that we try to give you as much time as we can.
But I do think we're thinking about 60 days, as long as that works out for all of the reasons.
Yeah, that's what we're hoping for. But again, we don't quote us on that. We'll do our best.
And again, Daniel Bass asks, will the total amount available for each NRC award increase in the next grant cycle? Again, that will be in the details of appropriations. And so again, we'll post approximate award amounts, I assume, in the notice inviting applications, but we can't know at this time. Then from Abigail Alexander, we have another question. As a potential new applicant who will attend the future webinar on the subject, I'm wondering about the possibility of choosing a geographical region like Western Hemisphere to allow for a project proposal that would support instructional development for a wide diversity of languages taught in my home department, with a justification along the lines that all of those languages are currently in use in the Western Hemisphere. Is there room for this kind of interpretation? I think this is the topic we'll probably address at greater length when we do the World Area Requirement webinar, but just based on that level of detail, probably. And that I think these details are also best worked out in future conversations and ongoing conversations with a program officer, for example, the Carolyn Collins for the Western Hemisphere over the course of the next year. Then we have another question. In the selection criteria, I noticed that outreach is not a category anymore. Is that included in the project design and rationale? It is still included in the selection criteria. It is in that the impact category for NRC. So outreach is still represented and is still one of the definitional characteristics of an NRC, along with all of the other characteristics that we've mentioned and that are listed in the new regulatory text.
There's another question, Brian and Tim. Do you expect that proposals that cover multiple regions will be reviewed by reviewers assigned to specific individual regions or by a separate group of reviewers with boundary crossing interest and expertise? So I'm going to answer that by saying you should attend the November 14th
That's right.
webinar.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And again, I just want to make a plug that you can drop us a line at any time by email or by using that form that we mentioned earlier, and we will be incorporating those questions either directly or indirectly into our future guidance and webinars over the next year.
Let's just say you're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. Thanks for all the thanks.
Well, as Tim is fond of saying, none of this would work without all of you in the applicant and grantee community. So thank you for your attention, and we look forward to presenting on these topics at greater length in the future.
As you can see, Carolyn has put a link into the to the question sheet. Thanks, Carolyn. You can access it right there in the chat. Please feel free to write out any questions, and we will try to incorporate answers to them in future webinars. The slides will be available on the website, on our website. You can look under the resources tab for NRC and FLAS, and you'll be able to find the slides there. I don't know how long that will take, but Carolyn could tell you more about that, or what we know is that Carolyn will be the one doing it. So,
and the slide deck it'll be posted a few places on the website. So under our new website navigation, there's a home tab where you'll be able to find it. There's the how to apply tab where you'll be able to find it, and the resources tab. So please visit the NRC and or FLAS website to get the slide deck, and also a link to the recording.
And if
Thank
you're
you, Pam.
unable to find it, please send one of us an email and we can direct you to where it is or send it to you.
I think that's a wrap. Thank you so much. That was excellent.
Thank you all for attending. We really appreciate everything that you do, and we appreciate your coming here to get up to speed on the changes.
And we'll see you next month.
See you next month, November 14th.